Look at how easily this build destroys Nightmare 100 dungeons. It has ludicrous damage output and is also the tankiest build in the entire game. The most recent patch contained 2 buffs to this build that took it into a solid S tier build and potentially making it one of the best builds in the entire game. One of those buffs is very obvious, but the other one, unless you're very familiar with this build, you might have missed it. But first we must discuss how this build is actually working. We're going to be making obscene use of Abhorrent Decrepify, which will reduce all of our cooldowns whenever we deal damage to enemies, and this will give us almost 100% uptime on both Blood Mist and Bone Storm. And this insane uptime on Blood Mist is where the namesake Infimist is coming from. While we're infinitely in Blood Mist, we're also going to be casting Corpse Explosions, which will deal our damage. So this build is able to deal most of its damage while being completely immune to damage itself. But what were these 2 buffs that suddenly made this build jump from an A tier build to an S tier build? And can this build compete with minions for the top spot for Nightmare Dungeon clearers? My name is Ruse, and this is Infimist. Let's talk about the buffs that brought this build back into the meta. The first buff was a buff to Wither, where they reduced the willpower requirement and the scaling. If you don't know, Wither is a legendary node that gives you basically a chance to crit your shadow damage over time effects, and both the crit chance and the crit damage are determined by the amount of willpower you have. As you can see from this graph on the screen, the more willpower you have, the more value you get out of each additional willpower point. So, what that means is if we're able to stack loads of willpower, this turns into a ridiculous damage multiplier. You'll see that when we get into the stats on gear that we're putting a very high emphasis on willpower on our gear, and our Paragon board is also designed to get as much willpower as possible. Let's talk about the second and not so obvious buff to this build. So, this build relies very heavily on dealing many instances of damage to many enemies at once in order to reduce its cooldowns and get crazy uptimes. Now, previously, in Nightmare 100 dungeons, they were just simply too easy for this build, and it would destroy everything and not reset its cooldowns. And because it couldn't reset its cooldowns, it was really struggling. However, in the recent patch, they substantially increased the density in every single dungeon. This means that it's very easy to get 100% uptime on Bone Storm and virtually 100% uptime on Blood Mist, and this is what's making the build so damn strong. On top of that, this build also scales ridiculously hard in AoE. The more mobs there are, the more procs of heat flesh you're going to get, which means you're spawning more free corpses. And the more mobs there are, when they die, they drop corpses, which allows you to cast bigger corpse explosions through Black River, which will consume multiple corpses to increase the damage of your corpse explosion. Plus, we're running the Barber, and you can see how the damage scaling of this build starts to get absolutely out of control in multi-target situations, which, with the buffs, is almost every situation. But, obviously, there is very key moments that are not multi-target, specifically against the final boss of the dungeon. And this is where we get into the discussion of Blood Mist versus minions. Blood Mist, Infimist if you will, does insane damage in AoE, and it's also crazy tanky. It doesn't care what affixes the dungeon has, it doesn't care what affixes the elites have, it doesn't care about anything. Minions, on the other hand, do care a lot about what affixes on the dungeon, and it cares a lot about what affixes are on the elites, as certain affixes will just destroy your minions and bring your damage to virtually zero. So, Blood Mist is a much tankier and much more consistent build until you get to the boss. Infimist takes, well, a while to kill the boss. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it will take you a couple of minutes. Personally, I've found it really enjoyable because I think boss fights are fun, but minions are still going to be one-shotting bosses, even with the buff to doubling the boss's health. So which build is better, minions or Infimist? Well, if you're only talking about single target and damage output for fights like Lilith or the final boss of a 100, minions are better. But if you're talking about overall consistency, speed of farming dungeons, the amount of trouble you're going to go through to farm dungeons, I much prefer Infimist. I think Infimist slaps Nightmare 100 dungeons. It is extremely easy. So this build slaps Nightmare 100 dungeons, but what aspects, what skill tree, what Paragon board, how is this build able to do them with such ease and consistency? Let's start that discussion by first breaking down the hearts and the core interactions that make the build work. The Sacrilege and Decrepify hearts are a key part of what makes this build work. Sacrilege will allow us to automatically cast both Corpse Explosion and Corpse Tendrils even while inside of Blood Mist. The Decrepit aspect will allow us to automatically cast Decrepit Aura, debuffing enemies with our Decrepify. This means we can completely remove Decrepify from our bar, freeing up a very valuable skill slot. We use this extra skill slot to run the Iron Maiden skill, which we're purely running to proc the Aspect of the Damned. Aspect of the Damned causes us to do 50% increased shadow damage to enemies affected by both Iron Maiden and Decrepify. We're also playing both Howl from Below and Black River. These two uniques add so much damage to this build. Black River will cause your Corpse Explosion to consume up to 5 corpses to do bonus damage and deal that damage in a larger radius. And Howl from Below will turn those corpses into monsters that run at enemies and then explode, dropping your Corpse Explosions on them. This means that the range of the build is really wide because no matter where we create the Corpse Explosions, they're going to run and hit enemies. This represents part of what makes this build so good for speed farming, because we're able to reach so much of the map at any given moment. Defensively, the aspect of Shielding Storm has always been a key piece of this build. It will cause your Bone Storm to give you a barrier every time it deals damage. However, because this build runs the Barber, we couldn't use this aspect until the most recent patch. This is because until the patch, Barber stopped the Aspect of Shielding Storm from applying a barrier, but now it's working again. So we're running Aspect of Shielding Storm and the Aspect of Ultimate Shadow, which the Aspect of Ultimate Shadow will turn the Bone Storm into a Shadow skill and apply a dot with it, which will give us even more barrier, so our barrier generation is ludicrous. We're also going to be running the Aspect of Might, so that we get more damage reduction every time we use our basic skill. And we're running the Aspect of Disobedience on our necklace, because armor is still broken, and this is still by far the best defensive aspect. The Exploiter's aspect is an aspect I've been experimenting a lot with recently, as it gives you bonus damage to enemies who are unstoppable. Now, a lot of builds, because they're running Barber, have crazy AoE damage but struggle against isolated elites. And the Exploiter's aspect, we can put it on our boots and will actually significantly increase our damage against isolated enemies. This is because we're constantly making them unstoppable due to our crazy CC output, and this is going to give us a 40% damage multiplier whenever they're unstoppable. We're also running the aspect of Explosive Mist, which will cause us to automatically cast Corpse Explosion while inside of Blood Mist, but we're already kind of doing this because of Sacrilege. However, the aspect of Explosive Mist will reduce the cooldown of Blood Mist every time it does this. This is why we're still running this aspect. Finally, we're running the Blood-Soaked aspect to turn our Blood Mist into a Shadow skill. This Shadow skill, Blood Mist, will proc significantly more lucky hits, giving us much better procs of Decrepify. On top of that, this aspect removes the movement speed reduction from Blood Mist, meaning that we can be inside of Blood Mist moving at our full movement speed. The stat priorities for gear for this build are different than most other builds, and I want to cover them now so that you can make full sense of it. Remember, we want as much willpower as possible because of the Wither legendary node on the Paragon board. But we don't want to take so much willpower that we lose too much tankiness, because every slot that we can get willpower is basically competing with survivability. This is going to be something you're going to have to balance on your own to perfectly min-max it, but we're going to be running willpower on our helmet and boots for sure, and you can also run it on your offhand and potentially your pants, and potentially your amulet if you're crazy tanky and play the build extremely well. For your offhand, you definitely want to be using a focus for the inherent cooldown reduction. This is the next piece of the build that's really important. We're going to want as much cooldown reduction and lucky hit chance as possible. So on our helmet, amulet, and offhand, we need cooldown reduction. We're also going to be looking for lucky hit chance with barrier and normal lucky hit chance on the offhand. On the amulet, we want lucky hit chance to have a barrier, and on your helmet, you also want lucky hit chance to have a barrier. Luckily, the Howl from Below unique has lucky hit, so we get it automatically on our gloves. On our rings, we really want lucky hit chance, maximum life, and vulnerable damage. For the last affix, just pick up whatever damage modifier works well for you. Between our chest, helmet, and legs, we want as much damage reduction and percent armor as possible. Look for ranks of Blood Mist on your legs for the increased cooldown reduction. That's going to do it for the gear. Next, let's talk about skills. For our basic skill, we're going to be taking Reap with Acolyte's Reap. This is going to give us damage reduction and spawn a corpse every 4 seconds. This is really useful. On our Core skills, we're going to be running Hued Flesh, which will give us a lucky hit chance to spawn a corpse. These corpse spawns are really valuable as they significantly increase our damage. For the Corpse and Macabre skills, we're going to be putting 5 points into Blood Mist, and then we're going to be going all the way to Ghastly Blood Mist so that it spawns corpses. The extra corpses it spawns are going to be vital for killing bosses, and in general just extremely useful for increased damage. And then we're also going to be putting 5 points into Corpse Explosion and going all the way to Blinded Corpse Explosion to turn it into a Darkness skill. We're going to be putting 1 point into Grim Harvest to get access to Field by Death, which is 3 points. Field by Death is going to give us 9% damage after we consume a corpse, so this is just 100% uptime. For our curses, we're going to be putting 3 points into Death's Embrace and 3 points into Amplified Damage. Both of these are just going to give us a bunch of damage, and then Death's Embrace is going to give us some damage reduction. We're also putting 1 point into Iron Maiden to proc the aspect that gives us bonus damage whenever enemies are affected by both curses. We're putting points into Decrepify, just 1 point, and then we're going to have Horrent Decrepify for the cooldown reduction. This is kind of the cornerstone of the build. This is where all of our cooldown reduction is coming from. Going on to the next category, we're going to be putting 1 point into Corpse Tendrils, and then going all the way to Plague Tendrils for the Vulnerable. This, combined with the Sacrilege Heart, plus just us casting it, is going to give us almost 100% uptime on Vulnerable. We're also going to be taking all of the Darkness skills here. We're going to be putting 3 points into Reaper's Pursuit for the movement speed, 3 points into Gloom for the increased damage, 3 points into Terror for increased damage against stunned enemies, and then 2 points into Crippling Darkness for chance to stun on hit. And the ultimate skills are going to be putting 3 points into Standalone for this massive damage reduction. This passive is absolutely ridiculous. We're going to be putting 3 points into Momentum Mori for the increased sacrifice bonus, just for more damage. We're going to be putting everything into Bone Storm, so we're going to get Bone Storm, Prime Bone Storm, and Supreme Bone Storm. This is going to give us a lot of tankiness, as will give us damage reduction, generate barrier, and then Supreme Bone Storm isn't that amazing, but it will help us proc the Barber, because our crit chance is so low that sometimes we struggle to get Barber procs. So for 1 skill point, I think it's kind of worth it for Supreme Bone Storm. Finally, we're going to be running Shadow Blight for a 10% damage multiplier. Moving on to the Paragon board, we're going to be taking as much armor, damage multipliers, and damage reduction as possible. We're going to be taking a ton of legendary nodes that are going to give us damage multipliers, and then for our glyphs, everything is either a damage multiplier or a damage reduction node. We're specifically putting the glyphs that increase the magic nodes nearby on the Paragon boards that have armor, because we're just trying to stack as much armor as possible. You can see a link to the full board in the description below, but that's the gist of what the goal of the board is. That's going to do it for today's video. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you leave a like and a sub, and I'll see you guys in the next one.